Depending on the argument, it would take a little more philosophical boost, I guess, to get to that supernatural realm, but they're very powerful arguments on the scientific side.
Well, one of the things you just hit upon there was the issue of God's existence.
Right.
And so we can talk about different kinds of arguments for God's existence. And I would imagine as a philosopher, you distinguish between philosophical arguments for God's existence and then maybe scientific arguments for God's existence.
Mm-hmm.
Let me set this up a little bit. At least when I teach philosophy or talk about philosophy, a lot of textbooks will use, at least that I have seen, the distinction between a priori and a posteriori arguments. Now, those are Latin terms, and they just simply mean a priori is apart from or before sense experience. So you rely on reason or rationality, whereas a posteriori relies on empirical evidence, or what we might call scientific evidence. Can you talk about that more? Because that's part of the distinction between philosophical and scientific.
Sure. So a purely philosophical argument that supposedly doesn't deal with anything in nature would be something like, I guess, the Anselmian ontological argument that says God is a being that which none greater can be thought. It is better to be outside the mind than just inside the mind. And therefore, God must exist outside the mind, because if he was just in the mind, you could conceive of another being outside the mind being greater, therefore he wouldn't be the greatest. So that would be a purely a priori kind of argument. You can have philosophical arguments that are a posteriori if they're more like cosmological, like Thomas Aquinas' arguments would be cosmological and a posteriori based on the nature of the universe, being contingent, for example. So if you have change, or in his second way, he says, everything that exists has to have a cause, and that can't go back forever, so there must be some ultimate cause that itself isn't caused. Now, way back in those days, philosophy used to be considered a science. So when we use the word science here, I mean more naturalistic science, like biology and chemistry and physics. And there are a lot of really good arguments for God from biology, and my particular interest is in more astronomy. But the more I see with biology and astronomy, the more amazing the arguments get every day. Some of the critiques with that, or some of the differences, if you start with a natural science that studies nature. So if God exists, if you think he's a theistic kind of God, or he's the creator of all nature, he can't be part of nature, so he would be supernatural. So we need some kind of move to get us from the realm of nature to the realm of the supernatural. And so we get very practical, very strong arguments from, say, biochemistry, cosmology, about everything being designed, and the amazing complexity that we see in cells, for example, and the design of the universe. And depending on the argument, it would take a little more philosophical boost, I guess, to get to that supernatural realm, but they're very powerful arguments on the scientific side.
So from the scientific side, one way, I guess, to put it is, to build a scientific argument, you kind of got to get out of your chair and get evidence from
right. So the philosopher, one of my professors used to say, my kids can't tell if I'm working or taking a nap. So to be a scientist, my wife is in science education, and so she would need microscopes. Scientists would need a telescope, or things to do experiments with. So you're actually doing more inductive analysis of things in the world as a scientist, and saying, well, we have X, Y, and Z here, and we don't normally see X, Y, and Z unless we see A, B, and C, being something like a designer. So whenever we see this kind of design, like in a watch, the Paley's watchmaker analogy, there's got to be some kind of a maker of the watch. So we see something in nature, in creation, that we say, when we see this, we always see intelligence. So once we see the cell or the eye or the brain or whatever, we see another level of intelligence that must be required to account for what we see in the natural order.